Hello, and welcome to our program on how to get noticed when coming from a non-target school. I'm here with Peter Hart, Indiana University class of 2008 and Harvard Business School MBA class of 2015. So Peter, thanks for joining me today. We're speaking on the topic of how to get noticed if you're coming from a non-target school. Based on your experience in the recruiting process and from what you've seen from OUBC students over the past 5 years, what are some of the overarching themes students from non-target schools should keep in mind?
Before we start, maybe it would be helpful to define what we mean by non-target school and why firms have target schools. At many companies, the recruiting departments are small and they're run by a handful of individuals across different offices. In addition, interviews are typically conducted by senior level professional services staff that are stepping away from paying clients. So as a result, firms tend to focus their on-campus efforts on a limited number of target schools where they can get the highest yield of students to make the most effective use of their resources. So while they don't rule out candidates from other schools, it can be more difficult for students outside of these campuses to get noticed. I imagine if they could, companies would love to send recruiting teams to every campus in the US in the same 2 to 3 week period. However, they can't. And they quite frankly don't need to in order to hit their recruiting targets. So don't take it personally or feel like you're out of the running, and don't necessarily take non-target to mean non-qualified. I'll also finish by saying each industry, firm, and company division has different target schools. So your first step should be to lay out all the firms in your chosen field and figure out which target your school. For those that don't come to campus, it's up to you to go to them. I think that for students from non-target schools, it's important to be realistic and understand you have your work cut out for you, because recruiters generally focus their attention on resumes from their target schools and lump all the rest into an other category. Without some sort of distinction, it makes it less likely that they'll even pick up your resume for review to begin with. In fact, I know examples where students don't get an interview at one firm, but then get an offer at their competitor. Luck can sometimes just play a big role. If I dare to generalize, I found that top consulting firms are more focused on the same set of elite undergraduate institutions, i.e. the Ivy League schools and the very top business programs. Where banks and accounting firms, I think driven by their large size, tend to cast a wider net and target a broader range of schools and candidates. Additionally, Nathaniel Kenninger, another OUBC alum and graduate of IU, made the point that many firms have broadened their definition of target recruiting schools to include campuses outside of the Ivy League and other traditionally high-ranked schools. Recruiters have recognized that there are talented, highly qualified students all over the country, and just because they did not or could not go to one of these universities does not mean you're out of the running. I also want to stress that any of these firms I'm discussing want to hire the best talent and will hire students wherever they can find them. But if you don't go to the school where they're looking, then getting the interview can be 90% of the battle. However, once you've got it, and assuming you've honed your interview skills, you stand just as good a chance as anyone else on the list, and maybe even uniquely differentiated due to your background, which could give you an edge. People love to root for the underdog.
So what should students do to get noticed so they ultimately get interviewed by their target firms?
So at target schools, recruiters get a chance to meet students, so they have slightly more information from which to draw conclusions when they make their interview list. However, if you're from a non-target school, all you have to differentiate yourself is your resume. So while they're interested in the whole applicant, I think you need to be realistic and understand that it's really important to have a high GPA and a strong SAT or ACT score. It's the first thing they'll ask as a quick litmus test, and they're looking to be really impressed right off the bat. They want to see high scores because they're unfamiliar with your school and major, and they might struggle to calibrate your GPA versus other candidates, or they may even just assume that your program's not as difficult or intensive as those from their core recruiting schools. A lot of people ask what the minimum GPA or SAT score is, and honestly, it varies significantly, maybe even on the mood of the resume reviewer. But as a cold read, a top management consulting firm, for example, assuming you have no other information, probably won't grant an interview unless the applicant has at least a 375 or higher, preferably with an accompanying 2200 on their SAT. Other firms may have slightly lower bogeys or require, for example, a clear leadership example. I almost hate to throw a number out there because as soon as I say that, I can point to several examples where that isn't the case and could discourage students who don't meet those criteria. The truth is, it just isn't black and white, but I think it's a helpful point of reference. In fact, I'm actually an example of an exception to my previously mentioned statement. But for a dead drop on a company website, you have to be pretty stellar. The most selective banks and consulting firms literally get thousands of applications for only a dozen spots. A high GPA along with a high SAT and ACT score is the first step to getting noticed. The best way to understand expectations is to look at the resume of students who have the job that you want as a way to calibrate what yours needs to look like. So now that you've passed the smell test, you need to differentiate yourself from others with strong extracurricular activities that show leadership, impact, and creativity. I would also recommend, especially with companies less familiar with your campus, that you be very clear describing your activities and clubs, because recruiters won't know if Club X or Honor Society Y is a big deal or if it's just fluff. I would also recommend that you maybe be a little proactive and try to do something that's really different. I started a real estate company when I was in college and ended up using that experience as my hook with recruiters through my process. I had other leadership examples in my fraternity and on-campus organizations, but that experience was different enough to set me apart from other applicants, so I always made sure to highlight it. Now, I'm not saying go do exactly the same thing, and in fact, you shouldn't, but go do something incredible that really reflects your personality and your professional interests. Raise money for a project on Kickstarter, or work with a professional to publish academic work, work with a local business as a consultant on a growth initiative for them, etc. I'm probably going out of scope here and just giving life advice, but you're young and still in school, so take a risk. Even if you fail, it's a great story and will probably be worth it more in the long run than any singular class you will take, and you'll have a great built-in answer to tell me about a time that you failed. You don't need investors to start a small business in your dorm or to start a campus organization. Prove that you're entrepreneurial and you have already developed the leadership skills. These traits are more reflective of your character, intelligence, and work ethic than what you learn in class. If it fails, so what? You haven't really lost capital, and it could be a really differentiating part of your story in interviews and in your cover letter.
Can you expound upon this concept of telling a story?
Sure. When I say your story, I'm talking about the facts, characteristics, and experiences you share that make up your candidacy. How have all the things you've done over the last 5 years made you uniquely qualified for the job? It helps if it's differentiating, relevant to the role they want to fill, and makes the recruiter want to hear more. Everyone will be a little bit different. I talked about being interested in entrepreneurship and starting a real estate company while I was in college. In interviews, I talked about my experience starting and running a company and then linked it to my interest in consulting because I was reasonably successful, but also learned that being an entrepreneur is hard, and it served to show me how much more I still had to learn. Consulting stood out as the perfect career to fill that learning and experience gap and give me broad exposure across a range of industries. It also helped that my school had a strong entrepreneurship program, so I felt it was a really cohesive message about who I was. But I've also heard theater majors talk about founding a theater company in a college town, linking the teamwork that required to produce and act in a show to the same set of skills consultants use to assemble a team of different individuals, many of whom are strangers, and who work together over the course of weeks and months to produce a common product. Students from non-target schools often have unique experiences compared to the sea of candidates most recruiters engage with. They may even ask you how you got the interview from your school. Spin the quote non-target school as a positive. You are the scrappy candidate with the alternative background who defied the odds and is willing to get your hands dirty to get the job done. This will grab their attention and make them want to hear more.
So what other ways can you get that coveted interview?
I cannot emphasize enough the importance of effective networking and really getting to know others in your desired industry that can give you advice and help you get noticed. Now, I understand that networking is tired advice, but it's critical to everyone's success. I'm not just talking about going to a random career fair and making small talk, but finding the connections in your life and asking for help from those individuals. If you do this poorly, it's definitely a waste of time and can even hurt you. However, it's the best way to get your resume pulled from a large stack and get an interview. Imagine if you were in charge of screening 300 resumes down to 30 spots. Why wouldn't you incorporate positive feedback from colleagues that met and liked a candidate? As mentioned previously, resume screeners don't typically have much information to go on and will use feedback and input from others to help them make decisions at the margin. The way you present yourself in person and the way you interact with others can be very telling of the type of employee you will be.
Great point. Can you give any tips on networking?
Sure. Especially for undergrads, it's important to realize that simply
Good
having
point.
friends
Can you give me any
a couple
tips
years
on
older than you
networking?
who are analysts or associates is not enough, because they do not make the recruiting and staffing decisions. These friends can be great for helping you understand the job responsibilities and helping to prep for interviews, but more senior people are the ones who have recruiting pull, so it's important to foster relationships at all levels of the firm.
That sounds easier said than done. Do you have any advice on how to accomplish that?
Well, it certainly is harder than it sounds, and there's a lot of interactions that may go nowhere or may just turn out to be a nice cup of coffee. But the couple that do click will be hugely valuable. I would start by thinking of any group that you belong to. People really like to help, especially if they're connected in some way, and these groups can be a great place to start. Conferences like OUBC and OUTC are excellent outlets to grow your professional and social networks with people from dozens of firms and other schools. Engage with everyone you meet, swap business cards, and follow up. Let them know that you're interested in maintaining a relationship and nurture it. You should also ask your family members to think about who they know or have them do a quick LinkedIn search on your behalf. You might be surprised whose old college roommate happens to be a manager at a firm that you want to work at. Most schools also have alumni networks or databases that students have access to, and I would encourage you to proactively reach out and develop relationships. I know alumni can seem like old adults who don't have time for you, and some are, but most are not. Just think if a high school student from your hometown sent you a note saying they were really interested in your school and wanted to grab a cup of coffee next time you were in town to talk about your experience. You would probably do that, right? However, if you start this process 2 weeks before the resume drop deadline, it's more difficult to make a credible connection and have them go to bat for you. So start early.
O4U targets an LGBT audience. Can we use our LGBT identities to our advantage?
As LGBT candidates, we have the unique opportunity to take the advantage of minority and diversity recruiting programs. Join an LGBT business organization like O4U or a professional organization like IRC. These organizations will introduce you to LGBT professionals at all levels of the corporate structure. I know I've had the opportunity to interact with very senior people at my job simply because we share being LGBT. People like surrounding themselves by similar-minded peers, and we've all had the experience of trying to succeed in careers dominated by non-LGBT identified people. Generally, LGBT professionals are more than willing to mentor and foster your career development however they can.
This all makes a lot of sense. Do you have any other takeaways to mention?
I'll mention something else that Nathaniel feels is important to emphasize over and over. To get noticed, leverage the network that you have. As I mentioned before, this is why an organization like O4U is so valuable. Use your current connections to the fullest and make more connections. It's amazing how many people are within 1 degree of you. My final takeaway is not to put so much pressure on your first job out of college, and maybe take the long view of your career. Hundreds to thousands of people are applying for the same positions every day, and even candidates who look perfect on paper won't necessarily be chosen. Choose a target industry and apply to as many places as possible. You may have a goal of a specific role at a specific firm, and that may not happen right out of college. It might happen in 2 or 3 steps. If, for example, you want a job in sales and trading, but you're just finding out that this even exists in your senior year, it might be hard to land a job at a top firm on a trading floor in 12 months if they don't come to your school. So first, secure a job, and then figure out how to position yourself to get to your target role. It might mean that you have to go back to school, meet the right person, gain more work experience, or do all 3. But be well-rounded and stay engaged with your professional network, and that will give you the greatest likelihood for career success.
Well, that wraps up our discussion. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me, Peter. I hope we've demonstrated to students who believe they didn't have a shot coming from a, quote, non-target school that it does not mean you're out of the running. It just means you may have to readjust your strategy.